Grace Carter's hands were still shaking when she set the pie down on Ethan Walker's porch. She had baked it at 4 in the morning. She had ridden 3 miles in the dark to deliver it. She had told herself it was just neighborly kindness, the same lie she had been telling herself for 10 years. Then she heard the laughter from inside. A woman's laughter. Light and pretty and completely unfamiliar. Grace stood on that porch for 5 seconds. Then she turned around, walked back to her horse, and never looked back. If you're watching this story for the first time, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. This one is going to break your heart before it heals it. The morning Grace Carter turned 26, nobody remembered. Not her father, who was already out mending the south fence before sunrise. Not the Hendersons down the road, whose baby she had delivered 11 months earlier when the doctor couldn't make it through the mud. Not the Calloway sisters whose garden she had replanted after the hailstorm took everything in June. Not a single soul in the valley of Harlan Creek, Wyoming territory remembered that Grace Carter had been born on a Tuesday morning in the summer of 1862, in the same farmhouse where she still slept alone, in the same narrow bed with the quilt her mother had sewn before she died. Grace didn't make a fuss about it. She never made a fuss about anything. She got up at 5. She made coffee. She fed the chickens. She packed a basket of cornbread and smoked pork for old Mr. Dubois, who had been bedridden since April and whose son was too proud to ask for help from a woman. Then she saddled the gray mare and rode out into the heat before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. That was Grace Carter's birthday. That was most of Grace Carter's days. She was not what the valley would have called beautiful. She was tall and full-figured, with strong hands and a wide, plain face that people said looked honest. She had brown hair she kept braided, and brown eyes that caught things, small things, the kind of things other people walked right past. A child favoring one leg. A widow who smiled too quick. A man who hadn't eaten. The women of Harlan Creek liked Grace because she was useful and never competed. The men respected her because she worked as hard as any of them and never complained. The young people came to her when they needed help and disappeared again when they didn't. And Ethan Walker. Ethan Walker had been watching her for 3 years without saying a single word that mattered. She knew it. He didn't know she knew it. That was the particular cruelty of it. Ethan was 35 that summer, and he owned the largest cattle operation in the northern end of the valley, 300 acres of Goodwell, a bunkhouse with 4 hands and a reputation for being the most decent man in 2 counties. He was tall, the way mountains were tall. Broad-shouldered with dark hair going silver at the temples and a jaw that always seemed to be holding something back. He'd lost his wife to fever 6 years earlier. He hadn't courted anyone since. People said he was waiting for the right woman. Grace used to think she understood what that meant. Then last spring she saw him dancing with Clara Finch at the church social. Clara, who was 22 and slight, and laughed at everything he said, and Grace understood that the right woman had a specific shape in mind, and that shape was not hers. She stopped hoping quietly after that. She kept working loudly because work was the only language she had ever been fully fluent in. The drought came in July and it came hard. By the 2nd week, the creek that fed the north end of the valley had dropped to a trickle. By the 3rd week, the Miller family had lost 2 cattle and half their grain crop. By the end of the month, 4 families had stopped eating regular meals and were too ashamed to say so to anyone but Grace, who found out anyway, because she always found out the same way. She always found the child with the favored leg, and the widow with the smile that came too fast. She started the food-sharing effort on a Thursday. By Saturday, she had organized 6 households into a rotating supply arrangement. Whoever had surplus that week brought it to the Carter farm, and Grace distributed it to whoever needed it most. No record kept, no names mentioned. No one made to feel small for taking. She did not ask anyone's permission to do this. She did not wait to be told it was needed. She simply saw the problem and solved it the same way she solved every problem, the same way she had been solving problems in this valley since she was 14 years old. And her mother was in the ground, and her father was half out of his mind with grief, and someone had to keep the farm running. Ethan showed up at her door on a Sunday evening with a wagon half loaded with salted beef and dried beans. She was standing on the porch going over her distribution list when she heard the wheels. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Miss Carter." He pulled the wagon to a stop and looked at the list in her hands. "Heard what you were doing. Thought you could use some help." Grace looked at the wagon. She looked at him. She had learned over years of practice to make her face do very little when Ethan Walker was involved. "That's a lot of beef," she said. "I've got more than I need. Plenty of folks don't. You'll want a receipt." "I don't need a receipt, ma'am. I'm keeping one anyway," she said, and went inside to get her ledger. That was how it started. He came back the following Tuesday with more supplies. Then again on Friday. By the second week, he was showing up without being asked, loading and unloading alongside her, riding the distribution route, when she had too many stops to cover alone. He worked without complaint, without direction, without making her feel that any of this was a favor she owed him. Grace told herself it was just Ethan Walker being. Ethan Walker decent, the way some men were decent, reliable, the way a good fence post was reliable, present without being particularly personal about it. She told herself that right up until the afternoon, he said the thing that ruined everything. They were coming back from the Calloway place, riding side by side in the late sun, both of them tired and dusty, and not talking much. Grace was thinking about the ledger entries she still had to finish before dark. Ethan had his hat pushed back and his eyes on the ridge, and he had been quiet for so long that she'd half forgotten he was there. Then he said, "You know something, Miss Carter?" She looked over. "What's that?" "Whoever marries you," he said, still looking at the ridge like he was talking to himself, and she just happened to be within earshot, "is going to be the luckiest man in Wyoming." The world stopped. Not dramatically. Not the way it stopped in the stories the preacher's wife liked to read aloud at the ladies' society meetings. Just quietly. The way a clock stops in an empty room. Grace stared at the side of his face for 3 full seconds. Then something broke open in her chest that she had spent years very carefully keeping closed, and before she could stop herself, before she could think about Clara Finch, or practical wisdom, or the 10 years of evidence she had accumulated suggesting that Ethan Walker would never once in his life look directly at her, she heard her own voice say very quietly, "I was hoping it would be you." The silence that followed was the longest she had ever lived through. Ethan turned his head slowly. He was looking at her now, really looking the way he had never quite looked before, and something in his expression shifted, something complicated and raw, and not at all like a man who hadn't heard her, or didn't understand, or wished she'd kept quiet. "Grace," he said. That was all he said. Her name. But the way he said it, she had heard her name said 1,000 different ways. Practical ways. Grateful ways. The way you called for someone you needed. The way you addressed someone useful. She had never once heard it said like that. Like it was something he'd been carrying around for a long time and finally set down. Her hands tightened on the reins. "I shouldn't have said that," she said. "Don't." "Mr. Walker, Ethan." His voice was quiet and certain. "My name's Ethan. I think after 3 years and more meals than I can count, you've earned the right to use it." She looked at him. He looked at her. The sun was going down behind the ridge, and everything was gold and shadow, and the sound of the horses breathing. "Ethan," she said. He nodded once, like that settled something. They rode the rest of the way home without speaking. But when they reached the fork in the road where their paths separated, he pulled his horse to a stop and turned in the saddle. "Grace." She stopped. "Would you—" He paused, pressed his lips together. Started again. "Would it be all right if I came by tomorrow, not for supplies, just to see you?" She had been practical for 26 years. She had been sensible and measured and wise, and all the other things women in her position learned to be, because hope was expensive, and she had never been able to afford much of it. "Yes," she said. "That would be all right." She rode home in the dark, and did not let herself feel how much she meant it, until she was alone in the house with the door closed, and then she sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both hands over her heart and breathed. She did not sleep much that night. Nobody in Harlan Creek knew about the exchange, but people noticed things anyway, the way people in small places always notice things, and within a week, the whole valley had developed opinions. Old Mrs. Hennessy told anyone who would listen that it was about time. The Calloway sisters whispered that it wouldn't last, that Ethan Walker was a man of position, and Grace Carter was a good soul, but not exactly the sort a man like that ended up with. Tom Finch. Clara's older brother told Ethan flat out over a drink at the saloon that he was making a fool of himself over a woman who was better suited to running a soup kitchen than a cattle ranch. Ethan looked at him for a long moment over the rim of his glass. "Tom," he said, "the last time I checked, you hadn't run anything but your mouth since 1882. So I'll take that under advisement." He walked out of the saloon, and the whole bar was quiet for 10 seconds. Grace heard about it secondhand through the Hendersons, who heard it from the barkeep, and she spent a solid 5 minutes pretending she wasn't smiling before she went back to her ledger entries. But there were harder conversations than Tom Finch. Her father sat her down on the second Sunday and said gently that he didn't want to see her hurt, that Ethan Walker was a good man, but a complicated one, that sometimes when a man had been alone a long time, he reached for the nearest warm thing without thinking clearly about what he was doing, and that Grace should protect herself. She sat across from her father and listened without interrupting, which was what she always did, and when he was finished, she said, "Papa, I've been protecting myself for 10 years. I'd like to try something different for a while." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and didn't bring it up again. Ethan came by the next day, and the day after that. Not always for long, an hour in the evening after his own work was done, sometimes just long enough for a cup of coffee and whatever she happened to be working on. He fixed a hinge on the barn door that had been stiff for months. He helped her move the heavy grain sacks her father's back couldn't handle anymore. He sat at her kitchen table with his hat in his hands and talked to her, really talked, not the polite, useful conversation of neighbors, but the other kind. The kind where you say what you actually think and wait to see if the other person understands. She understood everything. That was the part that kept catching him off guard. He'd say something he expected to have to explain, and she'd already be nodding, or she'd answer from a direction he hadn't anticipated, and he'd realize she'd seen something in it he'd missed entirely. He wasn't used to that. He'd grown accustomed over years of managing a ranch and a crew and the complicated social machinery of a small valley to being the person in the room who saw the most. With Grace, he wasn't always that person. He found he didn't mind. The drought was getting worse, and something else was happening in the valley. Something Grace had started noticing in the margins of the county records she helped the courthouse clerk organize every month. Small irregularities. Water allocation entries that didn't match the dates on the original land grants. A pattern of adjustments, minor and easily overlooked, that had been accumulating for at least 3 years. She brought it to Ethan one evening in late August, spreading the pages she'd copied out across the kitchen table. "This doesn't make sense," she said, pointing to a series of entries. The Walker Creek allocation is listed at 40% of original volume in the June records, but the original 1879 grant clearly shows 60, and the Henderson tributary. "Who has access to these records?" Ethan asked, leaning over the table. "Anyone with county business, but changes require the county clerk's signature." She paused. "Except these entries don't have his signature. They have a notary stamp I don't recognize." Ethan straightened. His face had gone still in a way she had learned to read, not calm, but controlled. "Victor Hale," he said. She'd heard the name. Everyone in the valley had heard the name. Victor Hale was the largest landowner in the Southern District, a man who had arrived in Wyoming 6 years ago with money that nobody could trace to any specific source, and a talent for acquiring struggling operations at the bottom of their luck. He was polished and generous at social functions, and had a lawyer who seemed to be permanently stationed in the county courthouse. "I can't prove it yet," Grace said. "But if someone has been systematically reducing the recorded water allocations for the northern ranches, then when the drought makes those allocations critical and ranchers start borrowing against their water rights, they'd be borrowing against less than they actually own," she finished. And if the county record is the legal document, the record is what's real, Ethan said, not what's true. They looked at each other across the table. I'm going to need to get back into those courthouse files, Grace said. The originals, not the copies. It could be dangerous. It could also be nothing, she said. I could be wrong. He looked at her steadily. You're not wrong. She had heard those 3 words from people her whole life, and they had never once landed the way they landed coming from Ethan Walker, who chose his certainties carefully and offered them even more rarely. I need a few more weeks to build a complete picture, she said. I need to find every discrepancy and document it properly. If we bring this to the county council half finished, Hale's lawyer will bury it. Then we'll build it right, Ethan said. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and reached for her pencil. Show me where you started. She showed him. They worked until the lamp ran low side by side at the kitchen table, her handwriting filling the pages, and his finger tracing the lines she pointed to, and somewhere between the Henderson water records and the 3rd pot of coffee, her father came to the doorway. In his nightclothes, looked at the 2 of them bent over that table, and went back to bed without saying a word. He was smiling. Grace didn't see it, but she felt for the first time in a very long time like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And in the courthouse in town, in a locked drawer in a back office, a stack of original land grant documents sat waiting to be found. Documents that Victor Hale had been certain no one would ever look at closely enough to understand. He had never met Grace Carter. He was about to. The next morning came fast and mean. Grace was at the courthouse before the clerk had finished unlocking the front door, her satchel over one shoulder, and her copy of the water allocation discrepancies folded in her inside pocket. She had been awake since 4. She had gone over the numbers 3 times. She was not wrong. She knew she was not wrong, but knowing and proving were 2 entirely different animals, and she needed the original ledgers from 1879 through 1882 before she could build anything solid enough to stand up in front of the county council. The clerk, a thin, nervous man named Aldous Pratt, who had held his position for 11 years and spent most of that time trying not to upset anyone. Important looked at her request form, and then looked at her, and then looked at the request form again. These are archived records, Miss Carter. I'm aware of that, Mr. Pratt. I helped you archive them in 1885, 3rd shelf from the bottom east wall. There's a process for... I filed the access request 2 weeks ago, she said. I have the receipt right here. He took the receipt. He looked at it. He looked at her again with the expression of a man who understood that he was caught between something inconvenient and something worse and hadn't yet figured out which direction the worse was coming from. I'll need to check with whom, Mr. Pratt? A pause that lasted about 2 seconds too long. I'll get the ledgers, he said. She sat at the narrow reading table in the back room for 4 hours. She went through every water allocation entry from the original 1879 land surveys, forward cross-referencing dates, notary signatures, amendment records. She found 6 more discrepancies she hadn't caught from the copies. She found something else too, a pattern in the amendment dates that put every single reduction within 30 days of a property sale in the Southern District. Not random errors, not clerical mistakes. A deliberate, systematic reduction of northern water rights running parallel to Victor Hale's expansion across the valley, timed with a precision that was either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence of something that would end careers and possibly end a man's freedom. She was copying the last of it when the door opened. She did not look up. The archive room is for authorized research only, she said, still writing. I know, said a voice she didn't recognize. That's why I'm here. She looked up then. The man in the doorway was not from Harlan Creek. She would have known him if he were. She knew everyone within 30 miles. He was well dressed in the particular careful way of men who wanted to look like money without advertising it, and he was smiling with the part of his face that didn't include his eyes. Miss Carter, he said. My name is Daniel Schofield. I represent Victor Hale's business interests in this county. I understand you've been reviewing some historical water allocation records. She set down her pencil. That's public information, Mr. Schofield. Of course it is. He came in and sat down across from her without being invited, which told her everything she needed to know about him. Mr. Hale has a great deal of respect for the work you do for this community, Miss Carter. The food distribution effort this summer has been genuinely admirable. Thank you, she said. He'd like to make a contribution to the effort. Say $500 to be used however you see fit for the families in need. The room was very quiet. Grace looked at him for a moment. Then she reached for her pencil and went back to writing. Tell Mr. Hale that the distribution effort is adequately funded, she said, but I'll pass along his regards. Schofield's smile stayed exactly where it was. Miss Carter, you're a practical woman. These records, he gestured at the stack of ledgers. These are technical documents. Water law is complicated. It would be very easy to draw incorrect conclusions from. Mr. Schofield. She stopped writing and looked at him directly. I managed my father's farm accounts from the age of 14. I have kept the books for 11 families in this valley. I have never once drawn an incorrect conclusion from a financial record. She capped her ink bottle. Is there something else you need? He left. She finished copying and walked out of the courthouse into the bright, hard heat of the afternoon and went straight to Ethan's ranch because she trusted her own courage, but she was not fool enough to think that what had just happened in that archive room was the end of anything. Ethan was in the yard when she rode up. He saw her face and didn't ask questions, just took her horse and walked her inside, and she spread everything on his kitchen table and told him about Schofield. When she finished, Ethan was quiet for a moment. He knew your name, he said. Yes. He knew what you were researching. Yes. Pratt told him. It wasn't a question. Probably, Grace said. It doesn't matter. The records are public. He can't stop me from reading them. He can do other things. Ethan's voice was level, but his jaw was tight. $500, Grace. That's not a contribution. That's a price. I know what it was. Are you scared? She thought about lying. She was very good at managing her expression, and she could have pulled it off. But she looked at him sitting across that table, with his hands flat on the wood and his eyes steady on hers, and she said, Yes, a little. Good, he said. Means you're taking it seriously. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his for exactly 3 seconds, brief and warm and certain, then pulled back and looked at the records. Show me what you found. She showed him. He was quiet for a long time after. 6 more, he said. 6 more confirmed. There may be others I haven't found yet. This is enough to take to the council. It's enough to raise questions, she said. It's not enough to prove intent. Hale's lawyer will argue clerical error on every single one. We need the amendment authorizations, the actual paper trail showing who filed each change and who approved it. Those should be in the county recorder's office, not the archive. Can you get them? I can request them. Whether Pratt hands them over this time? She paused. I think we need someone with standing to make that request. Someone the county recorder can't dismiss. Ethan looked at her. You want me to come with you? I want you to make the formal request, she said. You're a landowner of record. You have legal standing to request your own water allocation history. That gets us in the door. And then you do the rest. And then I do the rest. He nodded once. Tomorrow morning. They went together the next day, and the day after that, and 4 more times over the following 2 weeks. Ethan would make the formal request and stand in the outer office talking to Pratt about nothing while Grace sat in the back room with the records. She built the case layer by layer, not just the discrepancies, but the authorization chain, the approval signatures, the paper trail that led from each amendment back to a single notary stamp that, when she finally traced it through the state licensing records, belonged to a man who had been on Victor Hale's private payroll since 1881. The valley didn't know any of this was happening. The valley was busy surviving the drought. 3 more ranchers sold their operations in August to outside buyers. One directly to a land company that nobody in Harlan Creek had heard of, which Grace was fairly certain was owned at several removes by Victor Hale. The Millers were talking about leaving. Old Dubois had stopped eating regularly again, not because Grace's distribution effort had failed, but because he was too proud to keep taking and too stubborn to say so. Grace managed all of it simultaneously. The distribution network, her father's farm, the investigation, and Ethan with the same quiet efficiency. She had managed everything her entire life, except that managing Ethan was different from managing anything else she had ever done, because Ethan didn't require managing. He required presence, attention, the particular kind of honesty that she had spent years not practicing on anyone because there had never been anyone safe enough to practice it on. He asked her one evening, sitting on the porch in the last of the light, what she had wanted for herself at 20, before her mother died, before the farm and the valley and the years of being useful. She was quiet for a long time. "I wanted to go to school," she said finally. There was a women's college in the East. One of the circuit preacher's daughters had gone. I read about it for a year. She paused. "I had decent arithmetic. I thought I might study accounting. You'd have been very good at it." "I am very good at it," she said. "I just never got paid." He laughed, a real laugh, surprised and warm, and she felt it like something physical. That laugh, like the sound of a room she hadn't known, was locked, suddenly opening up. "What about now?" he said. "Now I want to put Victor Hale in front of a judge," she said. "And then I'd like to sleep for about a week." He was still smiling. "And after that," she looked at him sideways. "I reckon I'll think about after that when we get there." The romance between them deepened the way real things deepened, not through grand declarations or dramatic weather, but through accumulation. The way he remembered exactly how she took her coffee. The way she knew before he said anything when something was worrying him and waited without pressing until he was ready to say it. The way they had stopped explaining themselves to each other and started simply existing in the same space with the ease of people who had always known they belonged there. The valley was paying attention. Mrs. Hennessy declared herself satisfied and said so loudly at the general store. Tom Finch made one more comment at the saloon and found himself drinking alone for the rest of the evening because every other man in the room turned his back. Clara Finch saw Grace and Ethan leaving the courthouse together one afternoon and stood very still on the opposite side of the street, watching them go, and whatever she felt about it, she kept to herself, which Grace thought showed more sense than she'd previously credited her with. Then Schofield came back. Not to Grace this time, to Ethan. He came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon when Grace wasn't there and sat down across from Ethan in a way that suggested he thought the conversation would go differently without her in the room. He said that Mr. Hale had heard Ethan was having a difficult year. The drought, the reduced herd numbers, the cost of the feed supplements. He said that Mr. Hale was prepared to make a very generous offer for the Walker Ranch. Not a distressed sale price, a fair price more than fair enough for Ethan to relocate comfortably and start fresh somewhere less. "Get off my property," Ethan said. "Mr. Walker." "Now," Ethan said, "or I'll help you." Schofield stood, straightened his jacket, and smiled the way he always smiled. "Mr. Hale is a patient man," he said. "He's willing to wait until you're ready to be reasonable." Ethan told Grace that evening. He delivered it flatly, without drama, watching her face as he spoke. She was quiet for a moment. "He's moving faster," she said. "Yes. He knows we're close." "He's guessing," Ethan said. "We haven't told anyone what we have." "He doesn't need to know what we have. He needs to know that we're looking." She stood up and started pacing 3 steps, turned 3 steps back, which was what she did when she was thinking hard. "He's going to push before we're ready. We need to accelerate." "How much more do you need?" "The authorization records for the last 8 amendments. If I can get those—" She stopped pacing. "There's one more thing I need from the courthouse. The original 1879 Walker Creek survey. The one before any amendments. If I can show the council the original allocation and every subsequent unauthorized change in sequence." "We go to the council," Ethan said. "We go to the council." "When?" She met his eyes. "I need 2 more days." She went back to the courthouse the next morning alone because Ethan had a fence emergency on the North Range that couldn't wait. and she told him she didn't need him to hold her hand, which was true, and she preferred to work faster without company, which was also true, and which he accepted without argument, because he'd learned by then that telling Grace Carter what she needed was not a conversation that ended well for anyone. She was in the archive room for 3 hours. She found the original 1879 survey. She found the 8 amendment authorizations. She found something else that she hadn't been looking for, a document that stopped her cold. A letter misfiled between the 1881 irrigation reports written on Victor Hale's personal stationery, addressed to a man named Callum Reed, who turned out, when she checked the county property rolls, to be the notary whose stamp was on every single fraudulent amendment. The letter contained 3 sentences that were taken together, the clearest evidence of coordinated fraud she had ever seen in her life. She sat very still for a moment. Then she copied the letter word for word twice. She put one copy in her satchel. She put the other copy in her boot. She was 3 miles from the courthouse, riding back toward Ethan's ranch, when 4 riders came out of the tree line and cut across her path. She didn't recognize the men. She recognized the type, and she recognized with the particular cold clarity of a woman who had spent her whole life paying attention to things other people missed, that these men had not been waiting along this road by accident. She pulled the mare up short and held very still. The man in front touched his hat brim in a parody of courtesy. "Afternoon, Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Hale sends his regards. He thought you might want an escort back to town." "I'm not going to town," she said. "I'm going to the Walker Ranch." "That's a long ride," the man said. "Lot of things can happen on a long ride." Grace looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at each of the other 3 men in turn, and whatever they expected to see in her face, it wasn't what they found there, because the man in front shifted in his saddle slightly. "Mr. Schofield would like a word," he said. "Just a word. It won't take long." "Tell Mr. Schofield," Grace said carefully, "that I will be at the county council meeting on Monday morning. If he has something to say to me, he can say it there." She paused. "In front of everyone." She rode straight at them. It was a gamble. She knew it was a gamble. But these men had been sent to frighten her, not to harm her. Not yet. Not in broad daylight 3 miles from town, and if she turned around or tried to go around them, she would spend the rest of the ride looking over her shoulder, and she did not have time for that. They moved aside. Not because they wanted to. Because she left them no graceful option. She kept her pace steady until she was far enough down the road that they couldn't see her hands. And then she let them shake for exactly as long as she needed to. And then she made them stop. She rode straight to Ethan's ranch. He was on the porch when she came up the drive, and he read her face before she dismounted and was down the steps before she reached them. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. She told him, standing in the yard, her voice level and precise, the way she delivered information when she needed to hold herself together to do it. When she finished, he was very still. "You have the letter," he said. "In my satchel, and in my boot." Something moved across his face. "Grace." "I'm all right," she said. "I know you are." He said it like the fact it was. "I'm just—" He stopped, started again. "I should have been with you. You had a fence emergency. The fence could have waited." "Ethan." She looked at him directly. "I have been handling things alone since I was 14. I did not need rescuing today. What I need now is to get to Monday." He held her gaze for a moment. "Monday," he said. "We have everything. We have the original allocations, the amendment chain, the authorization records, the notary documentation, and a letter in Hale's own handwriting that ties the whole thing together. When I lay that in front of the council, he's going to try to stop you before Monday," Ethan said. "I know. Then you're not going home tonight." She looked at him. "My father, I'll ride over and explain it to him. He'll understand." His voice was steady and practical and left no room for argument. "You stay here. The documents stay here. Nobody touches them until Monday." Grace stood in the yard of Ethan Walker's ranch in the last of the summer light with a letter in her boot that could bring down the most powerful man in the valley. and looked at the man who had said her name like something precious 3 weeks ago on a dusty road, and felt beneath the fear and the exhaustion and the particular high-wire tension of someone carrying too much weight across a narrow bridge, something that was not quite peace, but was close enough to it that she could breathe around it. "All right," she said. "Good." He took her horse. "Come inside. I'll make coffee." She followed him up the steps and through the door, and her satchel with its evidence and her boot with its backup, and 2 weeks of careful, methodical work came with her, and the weekend between now and Monday suddenly felt like the longest distance she had ever had to cross. She didn't know yet how right she was. Saturday came in quiet, and that was the problem. Grace had learned a long time ago that quiet was not the same as safe. Quiet was what happened before something moved. Quiet was the valley holding its breath. She was up before Ethan, sitting at his kitchen table with the documents spread in front of her for the 4th time, not because she needed to review them, but because she needed to hold them, needed to feel the weight of the paper and know it was still real and still here. Her copy of the letter was back in her boot. The original documents were in the satchel. She had made a 3rd copy overnight and tucked it inside the lining of her coat, because she was Grace Carter, and she did not leave things to chance. Ethan came in at 5:30, took one look at her and the table, and didn't say anything about her not sleeping. He made coffee. He set a cup in front of her. He sat down across from her and looked at the documents. 2 days, he said. 2 days, she said. He reached for her hand across the table and held it for a moment, just a moment. The same brief, certain way he had in the beginning, as if he understood that she didn't need comfort so much as she needed to know she wasn't carrying the whole weight alone. Then he let go and picked up his coffee cup, and that was enough. It was enough right up until mid-morning, when one of his ranch hands came to the door with his hat in his hands and his face wrong. "Mr. Walker," the man said, "you'd better come to the North Range." The irrigation channel that ran along the north boundary of Ethan's property had been cut. Not broken cut. Someone had gone in during the night with tools and intent and taken apart 3 separate sections of the channel in a way that would take 2 full days to repair, and had already sent the water intended for his northernmost grazing land out across the hardpan, where it soaked into nothing. Ethan stood at the edge of the damage and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Deliberate," said his foreman, a barrel-chested man named Roy, who had been with him for 8 years. "Yes," Ethan said. "This wasn't random trouble." "No." Ethan crouched down and looked at the cut edge of the channel lining. "Clean work. Professional." "How much of the north herd needs that water?" "All of it," Roy said. "We move them to the south pasture. They're competing with the main herd for a source that's already running low from the drought. We start losing cattle in 3 days, maybe 4. Ethan stood. He looked back at the ranch. He looked at Roy. "Start moving them, and send someone to check the south channel." He came back to the house fast, and Grace was already at the door. "I heard," she said. "He's doing it now," Ethan said. "He's not waiting for Monday. He wants to put enough damage on the ranch that I can't fight a legal battle and a financial one at the same time." "He wants you desperate," Grace said. "Desperate men make deals." "I'm not making any deals." "I know you're not." She was already pulling her coat off the chair. "Roy said to check the south channel. I'll go." "Grace, you need to stay here and manage the herd move. I know this land. I've ridden it for years." She looked at him directly. "I'll take the documents with me." "Absolutely not. If Hale's men come here while you're in the field, then they won't find anything." He crossed the room to the cabinet on the far wall, opened the false bottom underneath the lower shelf, a hollow space the previous owner had built in, and most people didn't know existed, and looked at her. She hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she crossed the room and put the satchel in the cabinet. He closed it. "The copies in your boot stay with you," he said. It was not a suggestion. "They were already staying with me," she said. The south channel was intact. That was the first thing she noticed when she reached it, which meant the north channel damage was either a targeted message or the first phase of something larger. She was on her way back when she heard the hoofbeats. 4 riders again. Different men this time, but the same posture, the same deliberate placement across the road that she recognized from 2 days ago. Except this time, there was no pretense of courtesy and no mention of Schofield. The man in front reached over and grabbed her mare's bridle. "Mr. Hale wants the documents," he said. Grace's heart was hammering, but her face was still. "I don't know what you're referring to." "The satchel, the copies, everything you took from the courthouse." "I don't have a satchel," she said, "and I suggest you let go of my horse." The man didn't let go. "We can do this easy, or we can do it the other way." "There are 4 of you on a county road in daylight," Grace said. "I suggest you think carefully about what happens after the other way." They searched her. She submitted to it without flinching, which cost her more than she showed, and they found nothing. No satchel, no documents, nothing but the clothes she was wearing, and the look in her eyes that made 2 of the 4 men find somewhere else to look. They didn't find the copies in her boot. They let her go. She rode back to the ranch at a controlled pace and walked straight into the house and sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat on the wood and breathed in and out 4 times before she trusted herself to move again. When Ethan came in 20 minutes later, she told him everything. Straight through all of it. Same level voice she always used when she was containing something large. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence lasted about 5 seconds. "They searched you," he said. "Yes." Another silence. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was controlling something carefully. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Grace." "I'm not hurt," she said. "I'm angry. There's a difference." He sat down across from her and looked at her for a long moment. "He knows we have something. He's panicking." "Panicking men are dangerous men," she said. "They didn't get the documents." "Not yet." She paused. "Ethan, we can't wait until Monday. If he has men on the roads, if he's already hit the irrigation channel, he's going to keep escalating. We need to get to Council President Alderman today. Not Monday morning at the formal hearing. Today. Private meeting. Alderman lives 15 miles out. I know where he lives. I helped his wife through 2 winters of bad health. He'll see me." She stood up. "But I need you with me. This has to come from a landholder. You're standing my evidence." Ethan was already reaching for his hat. They rode together fast, taking the back route through the Henderson land to avoid the main road. The documents were in the hidden cabinet. Grace had the letter copies folded inside her coat. She had her ledger with every discrepancy notated, dated, and sourced. She had built this case the way she built everything, carefully, completely, with no loose ends. And she held all of it in her head with the same precision she held in the pages, because she had learned a long time ago that paper could be taken, but memory could not. Council President James Alderman was a lean, weathered man in his 60s, who had been administering this county since before some of its current residents were born. He came to the door of his farmhouse when they rode up and looked at their faces and said, "Come inside." Grace laid it out in 45 minutes. She didn't editorialize. She didn't appeal to emotion. She laid out the original allocations, the amendment chain, the authorization discrepancies, the notary trail, and last of all, the letter, Hale's letter, in his own handwriting. 3 sentences that connected him directly to the fraud, and she walked Alderman through every piece in sequence, and when she was done, she folded her hands on his kitchen table and waited. Alderman was quiet for a long time. "This is a serious accusation," he said finally. "It's a serious fraud," Grace said. "If Hale's lawyer gets hold of this before the hearing." "That's why we're here today and not Monday," she said. Alderman looked at Ethan. "You vouch for this." "I was with her for most of the research," Ethan said. "Every document she's shown you is authentic. I'll stake my ranch on it. You may be staking considerably more than that." Alderman looked back at the papers. He picked up the letter. He read it again. He set it down. "I can convene an emergency session Monday. Not the standard council meeting, a formal evidentiary hearing. Different rules. I can subpoena Hale's county filings directly, which means his lawyer can't intercept them." "And the notary?" Grace asked. "If what you've shown me is accurate, Callum Reed is looking at the end of his license at minimum. I'll have the sheriff's office pull him in for questioning Saturday evening so he can't be coached before Monday." Grace felt something release in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but the specific loosening that came from knowing you had done the work right and someone with authority had seen it. "There's one more thing," she said. She told him about the irrigation channel, about the riders on the road, about the search. Alderman's expression went cold and flat in the way of a man who has administered law long enough to know exactly what he was looking at. "That's intimidation of a witness," he said. "I know what it is," Grace said. "I'd like it on the record. It will be." He stood. He looked at both of them. "Go home. Don't travel alone. Don't tell anyone about this meeting. Monday morning, 8 o'clock courthouse." He paused. "And Miss Carter, bring everything, every copy. I want the complete record in my hands before Hale's lawyer knows there's a hearing." They rode back through the Henderson land in the late afternoon, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, it was full packed tight with everything they'd just put in motion, and everything that could still go wrong between now and Monday morning. "He'll find out about the meeting," Grace said eventually. "Probably by tonight," Ethan agreed. "He's going to do something." "Yes." She turned her head and looked at him. "Are you scared?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the honesty she'd come to understand, was just how he was built honest. The way the mountains were honest without apology. He said, "A little. Means I'm taking it seriously." She recognized her own words coming back to her, and felt something warm move through the cold tension in her chest. "We're going to win this," she said. "I know," he said, not because he was certain, but because he had decided which with Ethan Walker was the same thing. They got back to the ranch as the sun was going down. Roy met them in the yard with his face tight. "We've got a problem." The fire started at the east edge of the grazing land in the dry grass, where the drought had turned everything to tinder. By the time Ethan's hands reached it with the water wagon, it had taken a quarter-acre of graze and was working toward the fence line that bordered the Miller property. They fought it for 3 hours with wet burlap and water buckets and pure stubbornness, and they stopped it 50 yards from the fence and nobody was hurt, and the herd was safe and the ranch was intact. But it was a near thing. Grace worked the bucket line alongside the hands passing water until her arms ached and her dress was soaked and her hair had come loose from its braid entirely. And when it was finally out and they were all standing in the dark, smelling of smoke and looking at the blackened ground, she thought with a clarity that cut through exhaustion like a blade. He is burning things down because he knows he's losing. Which meant he was going to come harder before Monday. What she did not know, could not have known, was that Schofield had spent the afternoon in the county recorder's office with a clerk. Grace had never met a young man who had only held his position for 4 months, and who had no particular loyalty to the county's records or to anyone in this valley. What she did not know was that when she walked back into Ethan's house that night and went to the cabinet with the false bottom and opened it, the satchel was still there. But when she opened it, the original documents were gone. The copies she had made gone. The amendment authorizations gone. The notary chain gone. What remained was the original 1879 Walker Creek survey, which was too large to fold and had been left behind, and one loose page from the middle of the amendment record that had apparently slipped free and been overlooked. She stood very still with the empty satchel in her hands. Then she turned around. Ethan was in the doorway reading her face. "Tell me," he said. "They got in while we were at the fire," she said. The words sat in the room like stones. Ethan crossed to the cabinet and looked inside, looked at the survey, looked at the single loose page, looked at her. "The copy's in your coat." She reached inside her coat. The folded papers were there, her personal copies of the letter and the key discrepancy summary. Still there. Still real. "I have the letter," she said. "I have my summary notes. I have the survey." She paused. "It's not enough. Alderman needs the full documentation chain. Without the amendment authorizations and the notary records, the letter is circumstantial. Hale's lawyer argues it's a forgery." The silence was very long. Ethan said carefully, "Is there another copy?" Grace looked at him, and then she remembered. She remembered a Thursday afternoon in October of 1885, 3 years before any of this had started, when old Aldous Pratt had asked her to help him with an overwhelming backlog of county document filing. She had spent 2 days organizing and cross-filing and standard county procedure, a procedure Pratt had been too lazy to follow for the 3 years before she came in, but that she had applied to every document she touched because she was Grace Carter, and she did not do incomplete work. Standard procedure required duplicate ledgers for all water allocation amendments filed separately in the county recorder's supplemental archives, not the main archives, the supplemental archives, the ones in the basement of the courthouse that nobody had touched since she filed them, because they were duplicates, and duplicates were only ever useful when the originals disappeared. Pratt didn't know what he had down there. Hale's men hadn't looked down there because they hadn't known to look. "There's a second copy," she said. "Of everything." Ethan went still. "Where?" "The courthouse basement, supplemental archive, third shelf from the back on the left side." She looked at him. "I filed them myself." He stared at her for one long second. Then something broke across his face. Relief and disbelief, and something that looked very close to awe, and he said, "Of course you did." "I need to get there before Monday morning," she said, "before Hale's people realize what they missed." "We go tomorrow," Ethan said. "First light." Outside, the wind was picking up, and the sky to the west was turning the particular dark gray that meant a storm was coming in off the mountains, the kind of Wyoming storm that made roads dangerous and visibility poor and travel a genuine gamble. Grace looked at it through the window for a moment. "First light," she said. The storm hit at 3 in the morning. Grace heard it come in the wind first, then the rain, then the kind of thunder that didn't just roll but cracked like something large being broken in half. She was already awake. She had slept maybe 2 hours, lying on the narrow cot in Ethan's spare room, with her coat across her chest and the letter copies folded inside it. And every time she had gotten close to real sleep, her mind had pulled her back to the courthouse basement and the supplemental archive and the third shelf from the back on the left side. She got up at 4. Ethan was already in the kitchen. He looked at her and looked at the window where the rain was hitting hard enough to blur the glass and said, "The road to town is going to be bad." "I know." "We could wait until it passes." "We could," she said. "But Hale's lawyer is in town, and if Schofield figures out what his men missed last night..." "They'll be at the courthouse when it opens," Ethan said. "Before it opens," Grace said. "Pratt opens at 7. If Schofield gets to him before we do..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Ethan poured her coffee, pulled on his coat, and said, "We leave in 20 minutes. They rode out into the storm before 5 o'clock with their heads down and the horses working hard against the wind. The road into town was 6 miles of mud and running water and near zero visibility in the worst of it, and Grace rode every mile of it with the letter copies against her chest and her mind fixed on the basement of the Harlan Creek Courthouse and the filing system she had built 3 years ago with her own 2 hands. She did not let herself think about what happened if the documents weren't there. She did not let herself think about what happened if they were there, but they arrived too late. She thought about the third shelf from the back on the left side. They hit the edge of town at 6:30, and the streets were empty and running with water, and the courthouse was dark. Grace went straight to the side entrance, the one she had used 100 times doing records work, the one the staff used, and tried the handle. Locked. "Pratt has a deputy clerk," she said. "Young man named Hooper. He lives above the feed store on Callaway Street. He has a key." Ethan was already turning his horse. "I'll get him," he said. "You stay here." "Ethan, you stay here," he said, and his voice had the particular quality it got when he had thought something through and arrived at a decision and was not going to revisit it. "If Schofield's men come, you ride. You don't wait for me. You take what you have, and you ride to Alderman's farm directly." She wanted to argue. She didn't, because he was right, and she knew he was right, and arguing with right things was something she had stopped doing around the age of 16. 10 minutes, she said. 10 minutes, he said and rode. She stood at the side entrance of the courthouse in the rain, with her hand on the door handle, and counted. 8 minutes later, she heard a horse and turned, and it was Ethan, with a young man behind him, who was still pulling his suspenders up over his shoulders and looked like he had been asleep 30 seconds ago. "Miss Carter." Hooper squinted at her through the rain. "What's Mr. Walker said it was urgent?" "I need access to the supplemental archive," she said. "Basement level, right now." That's not regular hours." "Mr. Hooper." She looked at him directly. "I filed those records myself in 1885. I know exactly what I need. It will take me 15 minutes, and it concerns a county legal matter that goes before an emergency council hearing tomorrow morning. I need you to open this door." Hooper looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing, just looked back. Hooper opened the door. The basement was cold and dark, and smelled of old paper and stone, and Grace went straight to the supplemental archive without a lamp because she didn't need one. She knew this room the way she knew her own kitchen, knew where every shelf was and what it held, because she had put everything here herself. Third shelf from the back. Left side. 1881 to 1882 Water Allocation Amendments. She ran her fingers along the spines of the ledgers and found the right section and pulled the first volume and opened it, and her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The entries were there. Every one. Original allocation figures. Amendment chain. Authorization. Signatures. Notary stamps. Dates. Everything that had been stolen from the satchel the night before was here in duplicate, untouched, exactly where she had filed it 3 years ago, in the course of a Thursday afternoon's work that nobody had thought twice about at the time. She sat down on the floor of the courthouse basement and pressed the open ledger against her chest for exactly 5 seconds. Then she got up and started pulling volumes. She had everything she needed in 12 minutes. She carried it up the stairs in 2 stacks, and Ethan took the larger one from her without being asked, and they spread it on the table in the outer office, while Hooper watched from the doorway with the expression of a man who understood he was involved in something considerably larger than his job description covered. "I need to copy 3 pages, Grace said. "Key pages, in case." "There's paper and ink on the clerk's desk," Hooper said faintly. She copied the 3 most critical pages, the amendment authorizations with the fraudulent notary, stamps the final allocation summary, showing the cumulative reduction and the earliest entry in the chain, the one that established the pattern. She folded them and put them in her coat with the letter copies. She looked at the stacks on the table. "Mr. Hooper," she said, "I need you to do something. I need you to take these records upstairs to the council chamber and lock them in the evidence cabinet. Right now, before the courthouse opens. And I need you to give the key to Council President Alderman when he arrives tomorrow morning, and no one else. Not Mr. Pratt. Not anyone who asks for them. Only Alderman." Hooper stared at her. "Miss Carter, I'm a deputy clerk." "Yes," she said, "you are. And tomorrow morning there is going to be an emergency council hearing, and these documents are going to be the central evidence, and whoever controls them controls the outcome. I am asking you to be the person who keeps them safe for the next 18 hours. She paused. "Can you do that?" Hooper looked at the records. He looked at her. He straightened up with the slightly dazed determination of a young man who had not planned on being important this Sunday, but was going to manage it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Good." She picked up the larger stack and put it in his arms. "Then let's move." They were back on the street by 8 o'clock. The rain had lightened to a steady gray drizzle, and the town was starting to wake up smoke from chimneys. A wagon on Main Street, the sound of the general store being unlocked, and Schofield's horse tied outside the courthouse front entrance. Grace saw it first. She grabbed Ethan's arm without thinking and pulled him back around the corner of the building. "He's already here," she said quietly. Ethan looked at the horse. He looked at the courthouse door. He looked at Grace. "The records are upstairs with Hooper." "Yes." "So whatever Schofield does inside, he's not finding anything useful," she said. "Not now." She let out a slow breath. He's going to realize that fast. And then he's going to realize someone was here before him. And then he goes to Hale. And then Hale makes his last move before tomorrow morning. She turned to face him fully. Ethan, whatever he does today, we have the documents. We have Alderman. We have the hearing. He has 1 day left and he knows it. Desperate men, Ethan said. Yes, she said. So we need to not be alone, and we need to not be predictable. She thought for a moment. We go to my father's farm. We stay there today. I need to see him anyway. He's been alone since Friday, and he'll be worried. And Hale's men won't expect us there. Your father's going to have questions, Ethan said. My father is going to have more than questions, Grace said. He's going to have opinions and a loaded rifle and a very strong cup of coffee, and right now I want all three. They rode to the Carter farm through the thinning rain, and Grace's father, Thomas Carter, opened the door before they reached the porch, because Thomas Carter had always heard horses coming from a quarter-mile away, and he looked at his daughter's face, and then at Ethan Walker standing behind her, and said, "Come in and tell me everything." So they did. Thomas listened, the way he listened to everything completely still, no expression, letting it all land before he responded. When Grace finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You rode through that storm this morning to get those records." "Yes, Papa." "Alone?" "With Ethan." Thomas looked at Ethan. Something passed between them, a look that Grace caught the edge of and filed away to think about later. "You kept her safe," Thomas said. "She kept herself safe," Ethan said. "I mostly held the lantern." Thomas turned back to his daughter. "The hearing is tomorrow. 8 o'clock, emergency session. Hale will have his lawyer there." "I'm counting on it," Grace said. "I want his lawyer in that room when Alderman reads those documents aloud." Thomas Carter looked at his daughter for a long moment. Really looked at her the way parents looked at children when they were seeing them fully for the first time in a while. "Your mother would have been—" He stopped, started again. "She would have been very proud." Grace pressed her lips together and nodded once and didn't trust herself to speak for a moment. "Now," Thomas said, standing. "Breakfast." They spent the day at the farm. Grace's father made them eat, which was practical, and then he sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees and his eyes on the road, which was also practical. Grace went over her testimony for the next morning, the exact order she would present the evidence, the questions she anticipated from Hale's lawyer, the counter-arguments she had prepared. Ethan sat across from her at the kitchen table and played the role of hostile questioner, with enough conviction that she had to remind herself twice that he was on her side. "You can't prove intent," he said, using the flat, challenging voice he'd adopted for the exercise. "These could be clerical errors made over a period of years by different county employees." "The notary stamp appears on all 23 amendments," she said. "Callum Reed has held a notary license in this county since 1880. Cross-referencing the date of each amendment against Reed's documented movements. You can't document his movements. I don't have to. Alderman subpoenaed Reed on Saturday evening. Whatever Reed tells the sheriff between now and tomorrow morning becomes part of the record." She paused. "And if Reed is smart, which I believe he is, because stupid men don't stay useful to Victor Hale for 8 years, he will tell the truth, because the truth is the only version of events in which Callum Reed ends up with his freedom." Ethan dropped the hostile voice. "You've thought about this a long time." "I've thought about this for 2 weeks, she said. "It feels like a long time." He looked at her across the table with the same expression he'd had in the courthouse basement when she'd come up the stairs with 2 stacks of records. Something she still didn't have quite the right word for. Something that lived between admiration and tenderness, and the particular relief of a man who had finally stopped being alone with things that mattered. "After tomorrow," he said. "What do you want?" She looked at him. "I told you. Sleep. After that." "Ethan." "I'm asking seriously," he said. "Not about the ranch or the valley or the distribution network. I'm asking about you. What do you want for yourself?" The kitchen was quiet. Through the window she could hear her father on the porch, the creak of his chair. "I don't have a good answer to that question," she said honestly. I've been answering everyone else's questions for so long that—" She stopped. "I know what I don't want. I don't want to spend the next 10 years the same way I spent the last 10. Useful to everyone, and chosen by nobody," he said quietly. It landed with precision. "Yes," she said. "That's not going to happen," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "You sound very certain." "I am certain," he said, and the way he said it, level and simple, and without any of the hedging that men used when they wanted to seem sincere without committing to anything, made her heart do something complicated. She was saved from having to respond by her father's voice from the porch. "Ryder coming." Both of them were on their feet instantly. Ethan reached the door first, and Grace was one step behind, and they came out onto the porch, and Thomas had already risen from his chair with the rifle in his hands. The rider was alone. It was Roy, Ethan's foreman, riding hard from the direction of the Walker ranch. He pulled up in the yard with his horse blowing hard. "Mr. Walker, I rode to town first, then the Walker place, then figured you'd be here." He caught his breath. "Hale came to the ranch this afternoon." "Hale himself," Ethan said, "in person, with Schofield and 2 other men." Roy looked uncomfortable. "He said he wanted to make you a final offer. Said the hearing tomorrow was going to go badly for you. Said he had evidence. His words. Evidence that you'd been falsifying county records to build a fraudulent case against him." The porch went completely silent. Grace said very carefully, "What kind of evidence?" "He had documents," Roy said. "I don't know what was in them, but he left copies at the ranch. Said you'd want to see them before you embarrassed yourself in front of the council." Roy reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. "I didn't open it." Ethan took it. He looked at Grace. She nodded. He opened it. Inside were 3 pages. Grace took them and read them, standing on the porch in the gray afternoon light, and with each page her expression went more still, in the way it went still when she was containing something very large. She read them twice. Then she looked up. "These are forgeries," she said. "You're sure?" Ethan said. "I'm sure." Her voice was flat and absolute. "This page," she held up the first one, "is supposed to be a water allocation amendment request filed under Ethan Walker's name in March of 1883. Except I have the original amendment records from 1883 in the courthouse upstairs right now, and there is no Walker filing in March of that year. This date is invented." She held up the second page. "This is supposed to be a letter from Ethan to Callum Reed, requesting an unofficial amendment, except the handwriting is wrong. I have seen Ethan's handwriting on every supply list and delivery record for 2 months. This is not it." She set the papers down. "He fabricated a counter-narrative. He's going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow and claim that we manufactured the fraud evidence to cover up Ethan's own illegal water manipulation." The silence on the porch was very heavy. "Can he make it stick?" her father asked. "Not with what we have," Grace said. "But it muddies the water. It gives the council something to argue about. It gives his lawyer room to work." She was already thinking, her eyes focused on something none of the others could see. "He needs Reed to corroborate it. If Reed tells the sheriff tonight that Ethan was involved—" "Reed was subpoenaed Saturday evening," Ethan said. "He's been in custody since yesterday." "Hale doesn't know that yet," Grace said. She looked at Ethan. "Or he does know, and he's hoping Reed will change his story to save himself." She shook her head. "We need to know what Reed told the sheriff, before tomorrow morning." "Sheriff Baines owes me nothing," Ethan said. "Then he owes the county an honest hearing," Grace said, "and I've kept his mother's books for 6 years. She looked at the forged documents in her hand. "I'm going to town." "Grace?" Ethan started. "I'm going to town," she said again, with the voice that ended discussions. "I'm going to see Sheriff Baines. I'm going to find out what Reed said, and I'm going to be in that courtroom at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning with the complete truth, all of it." She looked at Ethan. "Are you coming with me or not?" He picked up his hat. "Always," he said. Thomas Carter watched them ride out together from the porch of his farm, and he held his rifle in both hands, and he did not look worried. He looked like a man watching something arrive that he had been waiting on for a very long time. The town was quiet when they reached it in the early evening. The rain had stopped, the streets were wet and empty, and the sheriff's office had a light in the window. Grace dismounted before Ethan had fully stopped his horse, and she was up the steps and through the door before he'd tied the reins, and Sheriff Baines looked up from his desk at the woman standing in his doorway with mud on her coat and thunder in her eyes and said, "Miss Carter, I was wondering when you'd get here." "What did Reed say?" she said. Baines leaned back in his chair. He was a big, quiet man who thought before he spoke, which Grace had always respected. He looked at Ethan coming in behind her, then back at Grace. "Reed talked for 2 hours," he said. "He talked about every amendment he notarized, every meeting he had with Hale, every payment he received. He talked about a letter Hale wrote him in 1881 that he kept because he was smart enough to know he might need it someday." Grace went very still. "He has a copy of the letter," she said. "His own copy," Baines said, "which he gave to me voluntarily last night in exchange for a conversation about reduced charges." He paused. "Miss Carter, Callum Reed has been carrying that letter around for 8 years, waiting for someone to come along who could use it." He looked at her steadily. "I think he's been waiting for you specifically." The room was quiet. Ethan said from just behind her shoulder, "Does Hale know Reed talked?" "Hale's lawyer came by this afternoon," Baines said. "I told him Reed was unavailable for consultation." A brief dry pause. He was not pleased. "The forged documents," Grace said. She put them on his desk. "He sent these to the Walker Ranch today. He's planning to present them tomorrow as counter-evidence." Baines looked at the pages for a long time. His expression went flat and professional, in the way of a man doing a job he took seriously. "That's evidence fabrication," he said. "On top of everything else." "I know," Grace said. "I need it on the record." Baines reached for a form. "Sit down, Miss Carter. This is going to take a little while." She sat. She told him everything in order with dates and specifics the way she did everything. Ethan sat beside her and added detail where she left room for it and stayed quiet where she didn't. They were in that office for 2 hours, and when they walked out the night had fully settled and the stars were out between the last of the clouds, and Grace stood on the step of the sheriff's office and breathed in the cold, clean air and felt not finished, not safe, not yet, but something like the solid ground of a person who has done everything that could be done and now has to stand and wait for morning. Ethan came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Tomorrow," he said finally. "Tomorrow," she said. He turned to look at her in the dark, and she could feel the weight of everything they hadn't said yet, all the things they had been careful about and patient about and practical about, while there were more urgent things to attend to pressing at the edges of this quiet moment like water against a dam. "Grace," he said. "Not yet," she said gently. "After tomorrow. Whatever you want to say it after tomorrow." He was quiet for a beat. "All right," he said. "After tomorrow." But the way he stood beside her the whole walk back to their horses' close, steady present said most of it without words, and she let herself feel that just for those few minutes in the dark before she put it away and thought about the morning. The courthouse would open at 8. Alderman would be there. Reed's testimony would be there. The documents would be there. And Grace Carter would be there with 23 fraudulent amendments and 1 handwritten letter and 2 months of careful work and every year of her life that had taught her how to see what other people missed and hold on to what other people dropped and stand up in rooms where people expected her to sit down. Victor Hale had spent 6 years building something in this valley. Tomorrow morning, Grace was going to take it apart piece by piece in front of everyone. She was ready. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean and left the town of Harlan Creek sharp-edged and bright in the early light, the kind of morning that felt like a verdict in itself. Grace was dressed before 6. She had her documents in order, the originals from the supplemental archive in Hooper's keeping her personal copies inside her coat. Her handwritten summary with every discrepancy, dated and sourced. And the letter. Always the letter. She had read it so many times, she could recite it from memory, which she intended to do if Hale's lawyer tried to question its authenticity. Ethan was waiting for her in the yard when she came out. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You ready?" "I've been ready for 2 weeks," she said. They rode into town together in the early quiet, and the streets were already moving. Word had gotten out the way word always got out in small places that something significant was happening at the courthouse that morning. Grace saw faces she recognized on the sidewalks. The Hendersons. Old Mrs. Hennessy with her shawl pulled tight. Roy from the ranch cleaned up and standing straight. 2 of the families from the food distribution network who had no legal reason to be there and were there anyway, because that was what community meant when it was real. Her father was already on the courthouse steps. He had put on his good coat. Grace stopped when she saw him, and something moved through her chest that she didn't have a word for some mixture of love and grief and gratitude that this man who had leaned on her since she was 14 had put on his good coat and come to stand on these steps for her. "Papa," she said. "I'm not here to interfere," he said. "I'm here to watch my daughter do what she does." He paused. "And I brought Mrs. Hennessy because she said she'd never forgive me if I didn't." Mrs. Hennessy materialized at his elbow. "I have been watching that child work for 20 years, she said firmly. "I am not missing this." Grace pressed her lips together and nodded and went up the steps. The council chamber was a long room with high windows and a raised platform where the 5 council members sat behind a broad table. James Alderman was already in his chair at the center, with the look of a man who had not slept much and had arrived early on purpose. The evidence cabinet was open, and the records were on the table in front of him, organized with a neatness that told Grace that Hooper had followed her instructions exactly. Victor Hale was already there. He was sitting on the respondent's side of the room in a dark suit that cost more than most of the ranchers in the valley made in a year, and he looked exactly the way Grace had expected him to look. Composed, faintly amused, projecting the particular confidence of a man who had never once been held accountable for anything, and saw no reason to expect today would be different. His lawyer was beside him, a city man named Marsh who had sharp eyes and a leather case and the practiced stillness of someone who made difficult things disappear for a living. Schofield was in the back row. He looked at Grace when she came in, and she looked back, and neither of them blinked. She sat down at the petitioner's table and opened her ledger and did not look at Hale again. Alderman called the hearing to order at 8 o'clock exactly. "This is an emergency evidentiary session of the Harlan Creek County Council," he said, "convened under council authority to examine evidence pertaining to alleged fraudulent manipulation of county water allocation records. This is not a criminal trial that determination is a matter for the courts. This hearing exists to establish the factual record. All evidence presented here will be forwarded to the Territorial Circuit Court." He looked at both tables. "Miss Carter, you petitioned this hearing. You may present your evidence." Grace stood. She had given testimony before at the county assessor's office, at 2 property boundary disputes, once at a school board meeting that had gotten unexpectedly contentious. She had always been calm because she had always been prepared, and she was never more prepared than she was right now. She started at the beginning. She presented the original 1879 Walker Creek survey. She walked the council through the allocation figures, specific numbers, specific acreages, specific water volumes. She laid the amendment chain on the table, one document at a time, each one entered into the record before she moved to the next building the case. The way she had planned it for 2 weeks, layer by layer, each piece dependent on and supported by the one before it. Until the pattern was not a suggestion, but an architecture. Marsh objected twice in the first 15 minutes. Alderman overruled both objections. The third objection came when Grace laid the notary authorization records on the table. "These documents have not been authenticated by a certified examiner," Marsh said smoothly. "The council cannot accept unverified." "Mr. Alderman," Grace said without raising her voice, "I have the original county filing receipts for every document on this table signed by the clerk on the date of filing. Additionally, Deputy Clerk Hooper will testify to retrieving these records personally from the supplemental archive this morning under council authority. She looked at Marsh. Is there a specific document whose authenticity you'd like to challenge? I'm happy to address each one individually. Marsh settled back. Alderman said, "Proceed, Miss Carter." She laid out the notary trail. She showed the council Callum Reed's stamp on 23 amendments across 7 years. She showed them the state licensing record establishing Reed's identity and county registration. She showed them the cross-reference between Reed's documented county work and Hale's land acquisitions, the timing, the sequence, the pattern that was visible once you knew what you were looking at. And then she picked up the letter. The room had been moving at a controlled procedural pace for 40 minutes. When Grace picked up that single page, something shifted, an almost physical change in the air, like pressure dropping before a storm. She felt it. She saw 2 of the council members lean forward without meaning to. "This is a letter written on Victor Hale's personal stationery," she said. "Addressed to Callum Reed and dated September 14, 1881. It was retained by Mr. Reed and provided voluntarily to Sheriff Baines on Saturday evening as part of a sworn statement." She read it aloud, all 3 sentences, slowly and clearly, so every word landed individually. The room was completely silent when she finished. Victor Hale was still composed, but his hands, which had been flat on the table, were no longer flat. Marsh was on his feet. "That letter is a fabrication. My client has never—" "Sheriff Baines," Alderman said. Baines, who had been standing along the side wall, stepped forward. "The letter was provided to me by Callum Reed in a sworn statement Saturday night," he said. Reed confirmed its authenticity and detailed the circumstances of its writing. His full statement is part of the evidentiary record. Reed is a discredited witness who— "Mr. Marsh." Alderman's voice was quiet and final. "Sit down." Marsh sat. Into the silence, Hale said for the first time directly in the controlled, measured voice of a man deploying his last resource, "Councilman Alderman, before this proceeds any further, I think the council should see the documents I've brought." He nodded to Schofield, who produced an envelope. "Evidence that Mr. Walker has himself engaged in unauthorized water allocation manipulation in concert with Miss Carter to construct a false case against me." He slid the envelope across to Alderman. Alderman opened it. He looked at the 3 pages inside. He looked at them for a long time without any expression on his face. Grace said, "Mr. Alderman, those documents are forgeries. The March 1883 Walker Amendment they reference does not exist in the county record. I have the complete 1883 water allocation ledger on this table, and there is no Walker filing in that period. Additionally, the handwriting attributed to Mr. Walker does not match his authenticated signature on file with the county property office." She reached into her documents and produced 2 pages. "I have Mr. Walker's actual signature on his 1879 land grant application and his 1882 property tax record. The comparison is not close." Alderman looked at the comparison. He looked at Hale's documents. He looked at Grace. Furthermore, Grace said the preparation of fabricated counter-evidence and its presentation at a county hearing constitutes evidence tampering under territorial law. Sheriff Baines received a full account of the document's delivery to the Walker Ranch yesterday afternoon and has included it in the evidentiary record. Hale's lawyer said something quietly into his client's ear. Hale did not respond. Alderman set the forged documents down with the deliberate care of a man who understood their significance. He looked at his fellow council members. A brief, wordless exchange happened between 5 people who had been administering this county long enough to recognize when something was conclusive. Alderman said, "Mr. Hale, do you have any additional testimony to offer this council?" Hale looked at Grace. It was the first time he had looked at her directly since she'd stood up, and in that look was something she recognized. Not respect exactly, but the specific expression of a man confronting something he had fundamentally underestimated and understanding too late what that underestimation had cost him. He said nothing. "Then this council finds," Alderman said, "that the evidence presented establishes a credible and substantive case for systematic fraudulent manipulation of county water allocation records over a period of not less than 7 years. The complete evidentiary record will be forwarded to the Territorial Circuit Court and to the Territorial Attorney General's office. Sheriff Baines, you are authorized to detain Mr. Hale pending formal charges." The room erupted. Not violently, there was no violence. This was a courthouse, and these were frontier people who understood the weight of official proceedings, but loudly with the particular release of people who had been holding something tense for a long time and were finally allowed to let it go. Grace heard Mrs. Hennessy's voice above everyone else, and would have smiled if her face wasn't still locked in the professional composure she had maintained for 2 hours. She sat down. Her hands were shaking slightly under the table. Ethan was beside her in the next moment, not touching her, not making a scene, just there, the way he had been there for 2 months, steady and present and solid. He leaned down and said quietly close to her ear, "You did it." "We did it," she said. "No," he said. "You did it. I held the lantern." She turned her head and looked at him, and something in her face must have given way, because his expression shifted into something she had no word for, and didn't need one. She just recognized it the way she recognized everything real, without having to name it first. "You said after tomorrow," he said. "It's after tomorrow," she said. He straightened up. He looked at the room at the council still at their table at Baines, putting his hand on Victor Hale's shoulder, at the families from the distribution network crowded in the back doorway, at Thomas Carter, standing near the window with tears on his face that he would later deny completely. Then Ethan Walker took Grace Carter's hand right there in the county council chamber of Harlan Creek, Wyoming Territory, with half the valley watching. She looked at their joined hands for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "There are things I want to say," he said, "when it's quieter." "I know," she said. "I'm going to say them." "I know that too," she said. He looked at her with that expression, the one she'd first seen on a dusty road 3 weeks ago, when he'd said her name like something he'd been carrying for years, and in it was every hour they'd spent at that kitchen table, every supply run, every cup of coffee, every moment of being seen fully by someone who chose to keep looking. 6 weeks later, in the last of the autumn light, Ethan Walker brought Grace Carter to the creek where their road had first bent toward each other. He had his mother's ring in his coat pocket. He had been planning what to say for 3 days, and forgot all of it the moment she turned to look at him. So he said the only thing that was true. "I spent 6 years being afraid to want something I might lose," he said. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." He took the ring out. "Grace, will you marry me?" She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had shown up at her door with a wagon full of supplies, and stayed without needing to be asked, and learned how she took her coffee, and stood beside her in a courtroom, and held her hand in front of everyone, and never once made her feel like a practical choice. "You finally got here," she said. "I know I'm late," he said. "You're exactly on time," she said, and she meant it. The wedding came in the spring when the valley was green again, and the creek was running full, and the drought was a hard memory that had made everyone who survived it a little more willing to depend on each other. The families Grace had fed came. The ranchers whose water rights she had restored came. The Hendersons came with their baby, who was walking now and got into everything. Old Mrs. Hennessy came in her best dress and cried openly and told everyone around her that she had known since 1885. Thomas Carter walked his daughter down the aisle with his good coat on and his chin up and his jaw working hard to hold himself together, and when he placed her hand in Ethan's, he leaned close and said something that only Ethan heard. And Ethan nodded once with the gravity of a man receiving something precious and understanding the weight of it. They built the cooperative network together that first winter. Grace's design, Ethan's infrastructure, the valley's participation. Families that had been too proud to ask for help during the drought found ways to give help during good years, and the whole arrangement ran on the same principle Grace had always operated on. See what's needed, do what's possible, keep the record straight. The ranch prospered. The valley prospered. Grace kept the books for 11 families, and also for their own growing operation, because she was the best accountant in 2 counties, and she was finally getting paid for it, which Ethan had insisted on from the first day, and which she had accepted because she had promised herself she was done arguing with right things. Years later, on an evening when the creek was gold with the last of the sun, and their children were somewhere behind them, arguing about something important, only to themselves, Ethan stood beside Grace at the water's edge and remembered a dusty road and a foolish man who had almost waited too long. "Were you right?" she said. She said it the way she said everything, quietly, directly, with that particular Grace Carter precision that meant she wanted the real answer and nothing decorative. He looked at the life around him, the ranch, the valley, the children's voices. This woman who had ridden through a thunderstorm with evidence in her boot and stood up in a courtroom and taken apart a fraud that 6 years of greed had built, and then had come home and built something better in its place. "No," he said. "I was wrong." She looked at him. "Lucky doesn't even begin to describe it," he said. Grace Carter looked at her husband in the evening light and smiled and said nothing, because some things were too true to need an answer, and the life they had built together, every honest day of it, was already all the proof that either of them would ever need. Sonnet 4.6. Lo,